Let's visit constants for a bit. There are a few things we can cover now, though we will need to revisit this topic again in the future when we've covered more material. The const keyword allows us to declare variables that cannot be changed after they are initially assigned. A variable that is declared as const must be initialized as some value. Using const is a good way to avoid hard-coding numeric values in your program. By declaring a const variable, you give that number a label or a name so that your code is more clear. Also, if you reuse that value a lot in the program, then you only need to reference the variable name instead of having to hard-code 20 here and 10 there and 20 here and 10 there, so that if you ever have to go back and change it, all you have to do is update the variable value. Const is also useful with pass-by-reference parameters. Sometimes you want to pass an argument by reference, not because you want to change its value, but because it would be costly to copy it, such as when passing by value. Non-primitive objects, such as strings or classes and structures defined by the user, can be potentially costly to copy. Here I've made a struct called user. Basically, you can use a struct to store multiple variables or even functions within one name, so our user has a first name, last name, city, state, and zip code. If we were passing a user variable by value, then everything inside of user, such as the 4 strings and the 1 integer, would also have to be copied over. If you have a big array or a big list of users, this could even be slower. Instead of passing the argument as passed by value, we can instead pass it by reference, but add the const keyword to ensure that the argument will not be changed. It is good practice to make a habit of passing any objects as const references, unless you need the value changed, then just as a reference. We will also revisit const when we cover classes, as it can also help protect the members of a class. Const can also come in handy when dealing with pointers and functions, so more on that later. So let's use const just to kind of not have to hard code values in. So let me include the string library real quick. And we say string student names, and let's say we have a maximum of 30 students. So I'm just going to hard code that as a const. So max students is 30. That way we can just pop that in there. We don't have to do anything else. You can say float GPA max students, so then, student 0 will be GPA 0. These will match up. And there are better ways to code these later on, but we'll just kind of treat these as belonging to the same thing if their indices match. So we have student names, GPA, and let's also have a student count. So we start at 0 because nothing's been entered. So we know we can go for int I equals 0, I is less than the max student count, I++, and we'll just ask the user to enter information about their students. So we could say student number I, and we'll ask them name, and let me create another end line here, and we'll say, well, okay, input, and we'll just assume their names are one word, not max students, I. And then we can ask also for their GPA. Okay, so normally we could do something like this. Student names 0, which is the very first one, is some value, or we can put a variable in there to access just one of them in the loop. So this will go from 0 until 30, or we could say, let's say we want to say enter another student, and we'll ask yes or no, char choice, choice. While choice is, well, no, if choice is equal to no, then we're going to break out of this loop. So it'll keep asking, and every time we add a new student, we're going to also increment the student count. So let's see, we run this, enter another student. Oh, it kind of ignored our thing. Choice right there. And I'll put this ends line right here. We can run this now. Enter another student. We'll say yes. Okay, so blah, blah, no. It'll leave the loop. So we're doing this because we have a maximum value of students. We know we can have up to 30 students, but we might have less than that. So that's why I have a student count. They'll go through and they'll enter the student information, and when they're done, they'll just break out of the for loop, and then we'll have some amount. So we'll say total students and the student count. Okay, so if I run this, enter a student, no, so total students is 1. Now this is student number 0. Most people aren't used to having their lists begin at number 0, so we could make this look a little prettier just by say I plus 1. That way they'll see student number 1, student number 2, and so on. So enter another student, yes, so this one will be Rachel. That's not my GPA, but we can pretend it is. And we'll have Bob, and he's 3.2, and we'll have, I don't know, another. And we'll have another 4, and say no more. Total students is 3. Okay, so say they entered in all the student information, and now we want to actually format it and print it nicely on the screen. Then we would want to go from 0 until the amount of students, the student count, not the maximum students. Because again, this is the maximum possible value it could be, but the actual amount that was entered in would be the student count number. So then we can type, let's have a header up here, we'll say name, tab, GPA, and then we'll have student names, names of I, we'll add a tab, and then GPA I. So, and then it will output like this. So that's one place where we could use constants, just like this. This isn't the most widely used reason to use a const, but if you are using arrays and you know that you're going to restrict it to some maximum amount, it could be useful there. Okay, now let's show a sample of how using consts would be good for functions. So instead of having you create the student information right here, let's create a function where you'll do that instead. So we can say void enter student, and we will want them to pass in a string for the student name, and a float for the GPA. So over here we would say enter student, we'd pass in this current student name and the current GPA. So at the moment I'm going to comment this out, and we'll basically have the same thing. We can even pass in I just so we know which number. So student number. We'll pass in I plus 1 so it shows, number 1 instead of number 0. Student number, int L, name, GPA, so they're inputting values for these two, and then when they are passed back, they'll be stored here. So these are passed by reference, and individual elements of an array are not automatically passed by reference. We would just have to declare it here. If these were arrays, they would be passed by reference, but just as single variables, they're not. Okay, so that's handled there, and we add the student count. It should pretty much run the same. But when we want to actually display the student, so display student, and we'll use the same arguments, parameters. Sorry, arguments are when you're calling the function. But here we'll actually say this is const for both of these. because we don't want them changing. And we just say student number, and then we'll have name and GPA. So down here, display student I+1, the student name at I, and the GPA at I. So we can do this again. Run, enter another student, and I forgot to get rid of the little header I have here, but this is how it's outputting. So that's not needed there. So here we're wanting to actually enter student information, so these are just passed by reference. And here we want to display information, and we're passing them by reference, but we're making them also const, so their values are guaranteed to not change. I cannot do this. Student name is now Bob. It won't let me. C++ will not let me. It won't compile. Okay.